Okay, everybody, I want to talk today about the mindset behind mechanics at Orange Nebula. Okay. We're talking game mechanics. What goes into how we make decisions about mechanics when it comes to games at Orange Nebula? So, Tom, I want to kind of start with you. What are your thoughts? How do you even think about what goes into the mechanics when you're working on building a game at Orange Nebula?
Well, I think we should probably start with this thing we've talked about before, but let's just get it out
Okay.
there. Often in the game design discussion, it's this question of what comes first, theme or mechanics.
Sure.
And sure, either. But we like to have a sacred concept for each of our games that is sort of, and well, it's a concept. It's a conceptual thing. Like with Unsettled, the sacred concept was group cohesion or group collaboration. And if we set this thing as the touchstone that everything spills out of, then we kind of have this guiding force for the mechanics and a place for mechanics to spill out of. And then we're not starting in a place that's like, all right, worker game, but iterate. Or, we're not starting with anything other than what would feel like this, what would serve this ultimate purpose.
What's the thesis?
Mm-hmm. And then
What is the
we have
thesis of this game?
this. Not only do we have a wide open playing field or what do you draw on? Tapestry? Not tapestry.
I was gonna say
canvas.
stage.
Thank you. Gosh. But also you have everything is in this framework that all the pieces need to be, we're going to have all these separate voices, but they need to sing the same song. And that is increasingly important as the process goes on. And we have 100 great ideas, but only room for 10.
Yeah, that's a super different experience than saying, I want to have a game that has these 4 mechanics and I'm going to make that work. That's way different than saying, I'm going to have a game that creates this experience. Now, what goes into it to make that work? Very different. Mark, as you've gone through building and designing and developing multiple games now, let's talk about kind of what that process has looked like with these games. I mean, when you started with Vindication, what was that like? You're just trying to make the coolest game ever. How do you decide what kind of mechanics go into there and what come out of there?
Well, so 2 things I'm going to answer with
'Kay.
that. Number one, I'm just going to follow up on what Tom said. The mechanics simply serve the sacred concept. Otherwise, you're doing it backwards, like you were saying. When it came with Vindication, I didn't know anything, so I was trying to do it all. It took multiple years. I didn't know how to do game mechanics. I wanted to have story. I wanted to have experiences that felt memorable, but I also want to do graphic design things. And so it was really just kind of like going to college for this. As it has evolved into other games and things that we're doing now, I think I view mechanics a little bit differently. They are largely the puzzle that the brain gets to solve, and I think there are a number of ways people look at that differently. Some people like to memorize and master the mechanics so that they can build a more efficient engine that kind of outperforms everybody else. Some people like to contend with the mechanic every time that they experience it because they like the problem-solving aspect. Some people like to make that so simple that it's not even present so that they can explore and have fun the way that they like to have it or play passively. And so this is why the sacred concept is so important, is because you want all of those people to have a really powerful, memorable experience at the table, even with each other, with different ways to get enjoyment out of it. And so the mechanic is just one piece of the puzzle. There are a lot of people out there I've found in the industry that think that the mechanic is the thing that makes the game. And I think it's one of the things that makes the game. I'm not really sure about the mechanic is where the game is at. I think there's a lot of other things that kind of create that picture together.
How much of what you have in your mind when you're going into it and you're starting to build mechanics, how much of that actually remains through the end of the game when it's ready to go?
Almost none of it.
Really? Almost none.
Designing the mechanics of a game is very much a experimental engineering thing where, we have these different mechanics, but now they need to interrelate. And the process of getting things to all interrelate changes them all, and you have multiple minds working on the thing. And, so we will find that the final form of something is, inspired by the original ideas, but it's always a little bit different and often radically different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the story or the experience or the game will end up delivering differently than your original vision. And I think we've talked about this before, but because that's true, because the destination that you end up at is different than what you set out to get to, all of those things along the way dynamically change. And so, I set out to make this game about this, and you find that 2 years later, well, that's kind of what I wanted to do, but this is kind of what we ended up with, and it's better, but it's nothing like what we had before. So we trimmed 80% of the mechanics that we had in our mind when we started, or more, and kind of had to adapt. Adaptation is a really interesting concept for this too, because I think a lot of game design is adaptation as you go through playtesting. Actually, playtesting happens at the late stages. In the development process, you are in a constant state of adaptation, and your environment changes, and the input changes, and the sacred concept is the only thing that remains. And so you're always serving this concept, and you're trying to make the journey richer and deeper for all those different types of, for as many different people as you can kind of invite into that experience. And so the mechanics they actually are just a variable, I think, at some stage.
What's interesting when you're talking is I'm recognizing how much, like, I have played games where I would guess this is probably exactly what was in the person's head when they started, because that's the goal, is to make this thing that's exactly what's in my head, and the game feels like it suffers for it. Like, and I think that's part of the mindset that we're talking about, is it's like, what is the goal? Well, and for us, the goal is to deliver something that really, adapts as necessary to deliver this sacred experience, as opposed, like, the sacred concept, as opposed to, this is going to deliver exactly this vision I have in my head, and I don't have the flexibility to realize the vision in my head wasn't what this really needs to be a full, complete, holistic, well-integrated experience.
I've heard you use the phrase trimming before a lot, but I actually kind of like this concept of adapting, like adaptation, much better than the idea of trimming, because even when you're trimming, you're just cutting things off. And yes, you're cutting things off sometimes for more things to grow, to give more space for more fruit to come, etc. But the idea of adapting seems way better, because as you get rid of something, then it gives room for something brand new to appear, or the simplicity of what something can adapt to. I don't know. I really like that phrase, adapting, much better than I like the concept of trimming, which you've used a lot in the past.
It's both, because I think what happens is, I think of it like, as you're on this journey making this game, you're picking things up and you're putting them in your backpack or your satchel or whatever you want to call it, your haversack.
What color is your satchel? Is it a leather satchel?
Yeah, it might be.
Yeah, I can see that.
And as
it's made from the
as
skin
you
of his
try
enemies.
things,
I was literally going to say
I know.
Skin of his enemies.
you try things and you experiment with things, you're adding more and more things to the pack. At a certain point, you can't carry it. And so we've talked about killing your darlings or trimming. You have to put some things down to make it simple. And I think at the end stages of game design, what you find is you have to simplify by cutting, by trimming, but it is a larger process of adaptation.
So maybe they're just separate things, trimming and adapting.
You can't have a game that has like 77 mechanics, right? It's just not, people aren't going to be able to.
With 76 or under, that's it.
Yeah. Or they can't withstand the cognitive load of decision making in the game. That won't be fun. It's just not even approachable. In fact, I've found over time that people really like something that they can get their arms around, even if it's simpler than something more challenging or has more depth. They're going to kind of gravitate towards something that's becomes familiar and easier to kind of approach.
What you just said, cognitive load, is, I think, a large part of where the adaptation as opposed to trimming comes into play.
Okay.
Because Mark and I both read this book by this guy named Chris Voss, who's an FBI negotiator. And in that book, it talks about how like a person can really only focus on like I think it was 9 things at a time. And what we find is as we start building the game, you're asking people to remember a bunch of stuff. And often what you're asking them to remember are rules or how your mechanics work. And part of the art of adapting the design is to make those rules be invisibly reinforced by the structure of the game to where the person doesn't have to remember it at all. So it's molding it and adapting it so that the 9 things the person is focusing on are options for them about being creative and using their agency in the world instead of running the game. And if you give them that many things to think about, and then on top of that, they have to remember 9 different rules about I need to remember to draw this and flip this over and this has to happen over here. Well, now they're using all their energy on running your game, and your job as the designer is to take that burden off of them, place that burden on the design, and let them just bring themselves to it instead of doing your work for you. And so that's a big part of, sometimes you're not trimming, you are reworking something to where it just is without them having to remember it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there is a learning curve there. So it's really about burying the learning curve, because no matter what it is, they're not going to come to it and not have to learn something. But if you can get them through the learning curve without having too many impediments, then it's going to be easier for them to remember, and then they're going to be more willing to be like, let me show you how this works, right? This is really cool.
Well, a very simple example, you can only have 4 of those. It's like, well, do you have to remember that? Or are there 4 slots? Now that's not even a rule that needs to exist. And that's a very basic, but just an example.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tom. And when we'll talk about that a little bit more, this kind of concept of invisible mechanics. Before we kind of move all the way into that, Jared, I want to come back to you a little bit. We talked about story versus mechanics, and then how Orange Nebula focuses a bit more on sacred concept. How does all of that play into the role that you have in building mechanics and building story within Orange Nebula games?
Well, I think the sacred concept for me applies a lot like a guiding principle, where it's like the airplane is already flying and I'm jumping into the cockpit, and like we need to be landing the plane without anyone knowing that there was a switch up of who the pilot was.
Okay.
And so, I mean, for me, it's like 70% of the time, a story beat will come first, and then I will need to mechanize it, and then like 30% of the time, it's like, oh, that mechanic is so cool, I have to make sure that it gets in there, and then I will like justify a way in the story for it to get there. But what I love is that along the way, every time I have one of those like moments of creative exploration and I see something new that the game could do, I then have that sacred concept guiding principle to know, like, is this going to bloat the experience, or is this helping drive home even more what we're here to do?
That's a good question to have to ask yourself consistently. Is it going to bloat, or is it going to, be in line? And Tom, I know that you've told me that you have like a document of guiding principles. Does this have? I feel like it should have a name, the Covenant of Orange Nebula. But like what kind of things, if he's asking questions like, is this going to bloat or serve, what kind of questions are on this guiding document for you that helps you to make decisions?
Well, I brought some notes from that. It's much longer on my computer. But one of the things he just said, this question of the word justify, is actually one of the things on there, which says the all things in the game must justify themselves, which basically looks like if this wasn't in the game, does the entire experience fall apart? And if it doesn't, then does it need to be there?
Interesting.
And we know we're getting close on something where nothing can be touched anymore. Like that's where we're at right now with Spiritfire, is we're trying to simplify and do this massaging thing and adapting. But it's to the point now where anything that we try to mess with, the whole thing starts collapsing, and we're like, okay, so that's a load-bearing beam. So is this. So is this. So is this. And then you realize, okay, we have everything that we need. All these pieces are necessary. But I can just go through these. This is going to be Tom making a list, and we can talk about them.
I have like 2.
Do it. Start us off.
Can I segue into yours, because my list is much less exhaustive. So one is that these are just like mini like principles that I have for myself about things that I want to bring out of my design. One of them is that mechanics and actions should sound fun, like in the universe from the perspectives of the characters. Like I never want anything to just be like, you grab it. It's like you rip it off of the thing.
Interesting.
And to have all of the like mechanics and also like all of the words tying back into what is actually happening from the perspective of the characters in the game.
Which reminds me of your acting background. You know, you're in
Yes.
full character.
Exactly. Like perfect example is like on Kogia, and I can't even remember if this one was like a me or a Tom was like, hey, this would be a good idea if you just changed this one word. But like in the macro coil canyon environment tile, you can jump from there to 2 spaces away, but instead of jump, that action is labeled boing. And so it's like you can boing 2 spaces away. And I love going back through and seeing ways that we can inject fun like humor and wit into any of those things.
That is a not insignificant change. That is a perfect example where I truly think that how things are presented is part of the mechanic. Because in your head, the difference between jumping from here to there and boinging from here to there is different. And it affects your experience, and not just in a thematic way. Like I truly believe how you process that action is different on an almost like brain chemical mechanical level.
And people will pick it right up. They're going to be like, okay, boing, boing,
And
they
all of
will.
a sudden, there's smiles and laughs that wouldn't have been there before if you were just, okay, now I'm going to go my 2 spaces over.
And then they say, this game is fun.
And then the other one I'll say before I pass it over to Tom is that I always try to, not with perfect accuracy, but I prefer for the things to be outsmarted as opposed to overcome or overpowered. And so like in the process of like mechanizing what people are going to be doing in, again, an unsettled survival task, for example, it's like, instead of how do we get more powerful than the planet, how do we take whatever this planet is doing to us and learn how to like move with it and use it for our own survival.
Beautiful.
Yeah, because why do people play games in the first place? You know, yeah, it's to have fun, but it's also to, I don't know, to outsmart, to prove something of yourself when you step into that. And being able to outsmart something is like validating something that is of value to them and giving them an opportunity to practice in a fun way things that are important to them about themselves. That's huge.
And practice what you've learned too. We're segueing now for a second, but you know, we were talking earlier with the community question about things that inspire us, and I actually tend to draw more from video games than board games as far as like game design principles. And one of the things that I always find amazing about the 3D Mario games is they have this routine where they introduce a mechanic and then they give you an opportunity to practice the mechanic, and then they just give you this giant challenge to prove your mastery of the mechanic. And like, it's a very simple loop, but it is always ends in you getting to demonstrate mastery of something or use it really creatively. And that in particular, unsettled planets have that sort of loop where it's like, okay, here's how this planet works, get used to it. Okay, good luck using everything you've learned. And then you get to feel like you just did something, which is what you want. That's exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, that's a really good one. Well said. Okay, so Orange Nebula design principles. I just pulled a few, and these aren't Tom's things. Half of these are like Markisms that I've just written down. But the first thing I have is similar to that. Where a player is getting to be creative, make puzzles, not jobs. And you know, oftentimes I'll be playing a game and it's like, I want to take this action, and the challenge is get X resources to do the action. And that's not nearly as fun as like you have 7 actions available to you. How will you combine them in a fun way to overcome something?
I did the thing versus I came up with a way to do the thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
100%.
instead of I have to do a chore.
Mhm.
So I have to go do this thing so that I can do that.
I
So-
get to figure this out.
So many games are just choose which button, like choose what order you're going to push your buttons in so that you have the right resources to, push this other button. And like, sure, you get to feel smart doing that, but you don't get to be creative doing that. And I think people want to have that creative energy when they come to the games. Another thing that we have, and this is particularly true for Unsettled, but I think it's true in all games, is this question of what is the thing? And so mechanically speaking, that is, what is kind of the central mechanic going on right now, and then make sure everything is tied to that.
Okay.
So an example in Unsettled would be, we're on this planet, and the thing that's happening on this planet is nodes rotate. Okay. If we just make sure now that all the challenges involve you needing to rotate nodes, all your abilities involve making nodes rotate or taking advantage of nodes rotate or being triggered by nodes rotating, then all of a sudden everything matters. So this random ability you have that plays off of that means that all these other abilities that are going off influence that, and now everything gets to speak together in a way that just makes creativity possible. Oftentimes, if you have 3 or 4 different things going on, you're like, well, I'm trying to do this node rotating thing, but all my abilities speak to this other thing that's going on. Which actually I think is a mistake that we made on Stranos, where there's 2 things. One is the nodes rotating, and the other is this different way that materials behave on that planet. And I think that was a mistake, because if you're trying to rotate the nodes and all your abilities care about the materials, well, then that doesn't matter right now. But if everything is just focused on this one thing, then it all matters all the time, and you get to be more creative.
Okay, so for mechanics, do they all matter all the time?
And that doesn't have to be universally true, but like asking yourself, and that's kind of what these are, is just like, here's a little lens to put on and look at this and see if there's changes that can be made. What is the thing? And if you recognize, oh, there's like 4 different things going on.
Yeah, it's a similar question to that question. If we get rid of this, does it all fall apart? Does everything matter all the time?
And there's an opposite question, which is, are there too many flavors in this recipe? Like, have we lost
Is it too complex?
the recipe because there's, let's add hot sauce to that, and let's add pepper to that, and let's add ice cream to that, and let's, like, there's just too much. And I think
Hot sauce pepper ice cream. I don't
it
know.
doesn't, it could be good.
Good. We could try it.
There are
I
some
will not
things
try
that
it.
that you overlook, because if you're just focusing on nodes rotating, like Tom was saying, you can't really explore that to the edges when you're distracted by all these other mechanics that you want to put in there. And so the discipline, or the principle, I would say, is we have to keep it simple, and we have to this is where the trimming comes in. And is it relevant to the experience, right? So that, like, in design, I always say, design is subservient to the message. It's the same thing here. The mechanics are subservient to the experience. Anyway, back at you,
No,
Tom.
I mean, that's very well put. Another thing we have, and this is really specific to board games, and is actually the opposite lesson from what, like, the design ethos of video games would say, is in board games, we like this principle of make the number 1 matter, as in one of something needs to matter. And in video games, there's a lot of this psychology involved of, like, how much gold should something cost? How much gold do you get? How many points should, like, I'm doing 5,000 damage, etc. But in a board game, the only thing processing is your brain and what the designers have invisibly done. And the idea that you have, I have 1 resource, that should be useful for something. You shouldn't need to have 10 of something, because now you're having to process.
Back to that cognitive load.
Yeah, and it does. It's exactly right. It's a cognitive load issue. So make 1 important is, especially for people who grew up playing video games, not an instinct that you bring to it. Everything has like this, 10. 10 is the cheapest something would be.
Return with 10 of X.
Exactly. It's like, no, return with 3, and they're all really interesting to get. So make one matter.
Like that.
Something we had to learn the hard way was the idea of don't punish fun. And this is kind of counterintuitive because
Because you want to punish fun.
because everyone you just want to crush them. But one of the things that we found repeatedly in playtesting is if there is a button that's going to get someone something good, but also at a cost, they will almost never push it, and then they won't engage with that part of your game, and they won't have a fun time. And so we had to, with much we really had a hard time learning that lesson. But it's like, if you want someone to engage with this part of the game, it just has to be fun bonuses. It has to really make them feel good and be a dopamine hit and bring the threat from somewhere else. But the threat can't be this expense for doing this thing that is going to be fun, because people won't do it. And they just will ignore that part of the game.
Yeah, it's the difference between a hard cost and an opportunity cost. 'Cause
Yes,
again,
that's a
you're
good point.
You're getting into the puzzle, like, which of these things do I want to do is much more interesting than how much do you want to pay? Like, that immediately puts a defensive, mindset in your head.
Especially if that payment is up front.
So in the context of Unsettled, the opportunities. The opportunities used to be much more, you investigate, a crazy thing happens to you that's usually kind of negative because alien world and whatever. But then there's this opportunity to take advantage of that moment and get something cool out of it. And in all of our playtesting, no one would do opportunities. No matter how much we turned up the goodness that would come from it.
After
the
cost.
idea that they were pressing a button where a mysterious thing was going to happen that might do something bad to you, no one would do it ever. Even if we said at the start of playtesting, do opportunities, they would not do it because
Interesting.
mysterious bad thing is not a button people will
They're
push.
stubborn.
And so if you
Smart.
want, so don't punish fun. If you want someone doing something, it can't buzz them when they hit it. Also, don't hide the fun. If the fun of your game is is everyone having all these abilities and then using those abilities in creative ways, you shouldn't have 80% of the game experience is grinding to gain those abilities, and then you have 20% of the best part of your game at the end where you're using the abilities. Like, sure, let people earn abilities or powers or items or whatever, but get them to the part of the game where they are being creative and using the abilities faster. Earning the fun isn't fun. So that's a
I love
principle.
that about Unsettled. That's how I make most of my decisions, is where am I going to gain more that I can get an ability? Where can I'm going to cross this. It might cost me this time, but I'm going to get, 3 comprehension. Comprehension is that the
Insight.
right term? Thank you. Let me say it again. How did I say it?
You did a great.
It's
first
great.
time.
Roll on.
I can't. I'm
Earning or paying dues for the fun and unlocking the fun, there's a really fine line between those. So that's something that we toggle a lot, because you could make an argument either way. But unlocking things as bonuses is amazing, but you just have to do something to unlock
As
them.
long as unlocking them is also fun.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Let's see. Other things we have on here. We have just a general light note that characters matter. And I think that is really true. I think a lot of games don't, including our games, sometimes don't recognize the power of a character that people connect with. Look at the top 10, 20, 100 media franchises in the world. They're all based around a very strong character or set of characters. It's not a setting. It's not a feeling. It's not an idea. It is Pokemon, Hello Kitty, Mario. It is characters. And, you look at some of these games that are just like colossally, ridiculously huge that blow up, like Genshin Impact and all these things. And you go into the communities and you're like, what are they talking about? They are talking about the characters. They're doing fan fiction, fan art about the characters. We have Luna in Unsettled. What is everything that gets talked about? Luna. People love an emotional connection with the thing, even if they don't think that's why they're coming to the game. You still, as a human being, like an emotional connection to a thing, even if you are someone that's there to be a human spreadsheet. And I am here for efficiency and power, and that's why I love games. you still latch on to characters whether you recognize it or not, and that is consistently proven true in our testing and our polling.
Right,
And
the love that you have for the efficiency and power has to go somewhere, and Luna will receive it.
yes,
Interesting. Yeah.
And everyone will latch onto a different kind of character. You know, I like the little scary thing. I like the thing that looks cute but will murder you or whatever. Like,
Yes.
but so you know, it doesn't all just need to be Pokemon, but people do really care about characters.
I like the thing that looks cute that will murder you, not murder me in the game.
That's fair.
You got to raise it from an egg
That's
for that
fair.
to happen.
Yeah, the grinding.
Ooh, Tamagotchi.
Is there more on there?
Quick.
It's like 97 more.
No, well, I did a good job of knowing this is about when you would ask. So there's.
He adapted the list to the current situation.
Let's see. People's minds should be processing strategy, not rules. We already talked about that. And then the last thing I had on here was we ask ourselves, what if we let them? That's the thing that we ask a lot because, again, if we're asking someone to take care of a rule, it better need to be there. And oftentimes we have found the games have gotten better just by us asking the question, well, what if we let them? And a lot of that is you come to design with these preconceived notions. It's like, all right, there's a hand size. You know, what's the hand size going to be? Is it going to be 5 or 10? How many cards? What's the hand limit that people can have?
I think actual hands.
yeah.
Whose
Sorry.
hands
Yeah,
are
you're
going to be
playing
playing this game?
You're playing a card game, but your hands are
Child's game.
huge.
Rachmaninoff hands.
It's hot dog fingers. No, like if you're designing a card game, you just assume, okay, there's going to be a hand limit. You're like, oh, you have more than 8 cards, discard down. And then, but take the time to ask, does there have to be? Does the game work if we just let them do whatever they want? And if we ask ourselves that, that's probably the question we ask out loud the most is like, well, what if we just let them?
Do not make a rule if there's no reason for the rule. It's the same thing.
And sometimes not making the rule means, yeah, more agency for the players. And they get to do what they want and be creative and have their own ideas and come at this from a weird direction.
Right next door to that is... Go ahead, Jared.
I was just going to say, in the realm of letting them do it, that's often a response that we have to feedback from playtesters about like, hey, I would love to be able to do X, Y, or Z in this situation. And we're like, yeah, yo, that's awesome. Why don't we let them do that?
So Tom was talking about the fact that you shouldn't make a rule if there's not one necessary, right? Why do we need a hand limit? If we decide that we need a hand limit, don't make a token. Well, what should it be? Just 8?
Nothing
Let's just
arbitrary.
agree it's 8. Like don't. It has to be compelling and it has to serve the sacred concept and it has to flow elegantly with the other mechanics, which is kind of a separate point in that you don't need a lot of mechanics, but they have to play well with one another. And there's a gestalt that happens. You know, the whole is worth more than the sum of its
Synergy,
parts.
some major synergy. That
Yeah, and in a oneness that comes from how the mechanics flow one to each other, that kind of belies the mechanics on their own.
If your game, if the sum of its parts if it isn't more than the sum of its parts, you have work to do still. No doubt. This Bandaid rule thing, no Band-Aids, is something we talk about a lot because we will encounter in playtesting, which is where I think you're trying to take us. So here's your transition. We will encounter something where it's like, oh, everyone keeps doing a thing that we can't let them do. And so then it's like, well, you know, quick rule that just says you can't do that. You know, but like that's a Band-Aid rule where it's like, no, we have to back up and make that rule invisibly enforced so that they're not having to remember that. Because you can very easily just have a game where now all the things I'm having to think about are these Band-Aid rules, or like you have to go to the rule book and you're like, no, there's this random weird fringe thing they say here.
It takes work. So here's an example. So if you have a game, Jared and I are playing this game, and it's like, okay, all of a sudden I look over and Jared's got 13 cards in his hand, and the turns are taking so long because he's having to analyze all 13 cards and be like, okay, that's too many cards. And then you say, well, what if he just, you know, based on the number of dice he has available? Well, he's got 5 dice available, but they're changing every turn. So now he's doing all this work trying to determine how many dice he has to determine how many cards he can have in hand. That's too much. That's too much work. That's chores. That doesn't work either. What we really need is a solution that's different than those things. It's just really simple to remember.
Someone help me.
Yeah, he needs help. Please.
Just give 5 card slots.
Can anyone
Right?
provide a game that can solve these problems?
If
One-
only he had bigger hands.
One per finger.
A typical Bandaid rule that we see in a lot of games is, like, okay, here's how all the resources work, or at any point you can melt three of them down to make a gold, and that's just like a thing that is, like somewhere in playtesting they were having this problem where people had too much of one resource or not enough of another, or they weren't able to make the conversion they needed to make, and it's like, well, you just 3 becomes anything.
3 sheep, 1 gold.
And it doesn't make sense in the game world. It's the thing you have to remember. It's not fluid. It's not part of the ebb and flow in a way. It's just a Band-Aid. Like, oh, here, that solves that. But there's usually, if you spend the time, a better way to solve that problem.
Amen.
So when I think about all of this, it really is dependent upon playtesting, which, like you said, heavy playtesting comes much more near the end of the development process, but you learn so much from it. Jared, what's it been like being a part of that playtesting process where you're getting a game that's, getting closer to its endpoint, but now you've got to play it and see it in action? What kind of things do you learn? What's that process like for you?
Well, it's really fun. I mean, I started as a playtester before I ever was working here, and so I had no idea where the projects were at when I was very first encountering them, and it was really interesting to hear, like, oh, we've actually already spent like months trying that idea that you just said, and like it's not going to work because of X, Y, and Z. And it was really interesting to hear like which parts of the game were totally like frozen solid, and which parts of the game were looking for like advancement and development. And the process of like receiving the playtest components was always super like easy, and I've always loved the way that any like feedback has been received, and I like since I've come on board and started helping with the reception of like playtester feedback out in the wild, I have felt in the times where I have been able to participate in the feedback collection, I have really enjoyed being like an advocate for the voice of the community and of the people who are playtesting in the room to make sure that like the things that they're seeing are getting addressed, and the things that they want to do that we're implementing, if they're reasonable.
Just a note about playtesting. Playtesting is not about removing problems from the game. Playtesting for me is about making sure that it is an enjoyable experience for as many types of people as are out there. And internally, we just did the Gallup Strengths Finder exercise to kind of learn how we're all wired differently and how we can lean into each other's strengths. And I think that this is really important because you're going to have X amount of designers on a game that are only going to represent how many lenses, right? And there's a lot of lenses out in the world. And so if you do a really good job with playtesting, what you're doing is you're allowing other perspectives to inform the work, which is just going to make it better.
And I want to clarify, because I suspect there's at least one, probably quite a few people listening to this that are like, what are you talking about at the end? Because playtesting is a thing that happens constantly as part of the process. But when we have a big team like we have, and we are all as obsessed with the whiteboard as we are, we have this rapid prototyping thing that is just happening all the time in the conference room at the whiteboard, where it's like, all right, here's all the rules, let's play through it. And we go for 10 minutes and they're like, wait, this isn't working. And we blow the whole thing up and try something different. And so like, I don't want us to inadvertently give the impression that like
there's no play
that we
testing
make a
until
game
the
and then play test it. Like
'Cause
that is
possible.
constantly happening.
Yeah.
But we have big industrial printers and we print things up and destroy it all 10 minutes later. And that is, so if you're working on a game, where's the camera? There it is. If you're working on a game, it is really crucial to be constantly testing it, because you will definitely find, if you spend too much time finessing some little details on a system that you think totally works, the second it hits the table, the whole, like no plan survives contact with the enemy. It's very much the same thing with your player base. Like whatever you've designed, you put it in front of players and they're immediately going to break it, not like it, do something weird. The whole thing's going to fall apart. And you have to be doing that the whole time with every idea. because you can easily fuss on something for 3 weeks and then realize that time was totally wasted because it
It's
just
never gonna
doesn't
work when it actually
And,
plays.
Yeah, so you do have to be rapidly testing all the time. It's just different from, okay, we have now made 15 prototype copies to send out to the community for stress testing. That's just a different phase of the playtesting process.
Yeah, and it's probably, it seems to me like that during that playtesting time is a lot of the, okay, so was it fun? What kept it from being fun? Where was the constriction of fun and freedom? Whereas what you're doing in a lot of the playtesting and iterating when you're working internally is, does this work? Does this work? Does this work?
The final round of playtesting, a lot of it is just like, was there some wording that hung everyone up? Like, this card's meant to do this certain thing, which works, and we know because we have playtested it a bunch in the office, but we all know what it's supposed to do. And when that card hits the wild, is there 4 different interpretations of how it's supposed to work? Like, that's kind of what the final round
That
of
makes good
playtesting
sense.
is.
I think it gets overlooked a lot that playtesting is not what I was thinking when this was happening, but also what I was feeling when this was happening. And I would suggest that this is widely overlooked. Now, this is largely my branding background speaking, but the emotional aspect of playing games is just as critical as the rational aspect of playing games and what you're doing. What you're thinking is one thing, but what you're feeling is where the fun comes from. Is it fun to think that? Is it fun to do that? So that there's a toggle between those two worlds that we could probably go on and on for a whole nother episode.
But I don't think we should. I think I think this is a good conversation, and I think it's honestly a good place to wrap. I'm curious from people who are watching on YouTube in comment sections. Have you noticed this? What have you noticed in our games that you felt really great about as you went through the mechanics process? Or what other experiences or games have you been a part of where you know that those invisible mechanics really did their job well because it was just so smooth to play? Or what did we say in this conversation that totally confused you and you have more questions about now? You can ask those in the comment section. And then any other things that you're interested or curious to learn or hear us talk about, bring them to the Discord channel. Discord is where we're going to be finding all of our community questions consistently, and we want to hear from you there. That place it's alive. Okay, so you can go there, orangenebula.com/Discord, and we're excited to see you there.
It's weirdly active.
It's weirdly active. There's a lot of people with large hands. It's just hot dog
And
fingers
small hands.
and small
You can
hands.
have small hands.
How big are the hands? Okay, bye.
Bye.
What I was going to say is right next door to...
What's in your mouth? Did you have something in your
know.
mouth just now?
Growl.
Looked like you had
Was I
a cough
eating
drop in
something?
there.
Quick. Keep growling.
Menthol. Where are you going? Bye.
Standard slot talk. You know how we do. I like this little light that we have. This little light that we have.
If there's a... Yeah, thank you.
He had that prepared to cover. That's awesome.
So right now...
Don't
he
reference
pulls
it. Keep
out.
going.
What about medium-sized hands?
They type fast. Medium size, it doesn't matter.
What if they're slow typers?
I
It's
don't know.
okay.
Tell us,
Typists.
how big are your hands?
I slept through like 3 alarms this morning.
Can you prompt me again?
Is there something in your mouth though?
I don't know. Is there?
Do you?
Was I
You
chewing
keep doing
something?
this. Okay. Do you need a drink?
Am I weird?
I don't know. Are you cow cutting over there? Is that...
What I was going to say is Tom was making the point about, and I'm still looking at the towel now.
When did I turn into a towel?
I don't even want it there.
See? We're all connected.
Okay, here we go.